Welcome back to the Swamp 24/7 podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Goldcamp, here with my co-host, Blake Alderman. Obviously, guys, we shot a podcast on Sunday afternoon, or really Sunday morning is when we shot. Podcast was posted midday Sunday, and then very shortly after, the news started to trickle out that Florida was parting ways with head coach Dan Mullen. So, Blake, I guess first and foremost, I want to lay out this podcast today in a couple different ways. We've obviously been reporting on Florida's coaching search for the last 36 hours or so. We've had some news and notes that we've posted on Swamp 24/7 for our subscribers. And we'll touch on some of that, but probably not all of that. What I want to do on this podcast is focus more kind of on the big picture process. You know, what Florida's looking for, why different candidates may make sense, why Florida moved on from Dan Mullen. So I guess, Blake, first and foremost, we have talked about it a lot on this podcast about feeling like kind of the end for Dan Mullen was a little bit inevitable. But what's your sense of why ultimately Florida pulled the trigger and decided it needed to make a move?
Well, I just think you look at just the loyalty he's had to coaching staff members that weren't getting it done on the recruiting trail. You look at even last year where Florida had a historically bad defense. Todd Grantham was still retained. You know, you kind of had some scapegoats of, Torian Gray, who I think was more one than more so Ron English. I think Ron English was a guy that you could easily say was an upgrade, and, with a guy like, McGriff. I think whenever you look at just the recruiting, it wasn't quite there up to standards. Even this year, there wasn't a lot of confidence of that the talent coming in. You look at a lot of the guys that Mullen had success with in that 2020 season. Obviously, he coached them up, but those weren't his guys. You look at the future, some of the guys that Florida had coming in under Mullen in the recruiting classes and whatnot, you just saw a drop off. So I think just that, I don't know that there was a lot of confidence that, this roster was going to continue to get better other than using the portal here and there, which is kind of a Band-Aid in some areas. So in my opinion, that was more what it is. I think whenever you have a guy that is a genius X's and O's play caller, I feel really confident saying that Mullen is one of the best in college football of just the game day X's and O's, really knowing an offense. But I think all the other facets of the program, I just think he really was starting to struggle with, and it was becoming more and more predominant as his tenure went on.
Yeah, I think the sense that I got, from listening to athletics director Scott Strickland talk about the decision to make the change, I think it's very much that he felt when he hired Dan Mullen that he was getting a guy that had shown he could build up a program kind of from the ground up at Mississippi State, and then he had proven that he was able to kind of sustain at least a reasonably high degree of success at that program. Now, the thought was hopefully that would translate better at Florida with better talent. I think to the point you made about recruiting, that was hard to really see manifest itself in his time at UF. It never really materialized, where those arguments of just wait till you see what he does with UF talent, that just never really happened under Dan Mullen's tenure. And I think that was part of the reason, Scott Strickland felt this needed to go a different direction. But I also think part of it is what Strickland talked about, what they're looking for in a new hire, which is they want a guy that can come in and sustain that success at a high level for a long time. And, Dan Mullen actually pointed to that in really, I don't know if it was his first press conference, so I don't want to be quoted on that, but it was either sometime early in his tenure, he talked about, and it might have been a Gator booster tour kind of thing, but he talked about Florida had, gone through prior to his arrival, an SEC East title in 2012 with Will Muschamp. Granted, they didn't go to Atlanta that year, but they had won the division title. And then a couple years later, you have the 4-8 season a year later. Jim McElwain comes in, wins the SEC East twice, but then you have another 4-win season. And so he kind of described it going like this. And what he had hoped to do was kind of raise, that expectation and that standard. And you see it on the field. I mean, 5-6, they just haven't accomplished that end. And so I think, Blake, let's talk about what we think Florida's looking for in a new guy. I don't know if there was anything that maybe stuck out to you from what Scott Strickland said, but what is your thinking as far as what Florida is probably looking for and then what they actually need, in your opinion?
From my opinion of what they're looking for, I think they're looking for someone that's going to bring some juice in the program, going to energize things, going to be a relentless recruiter, really kind of be that CEO type of person in a program, have the staff there, have trust in them to know that they're going to get the job done. That was kind of my takeaways. And I think a lot of that really has, in my opinion, I think that's what you need. I think you need a guy that's going to understand that, you're in the state of Florida, you really shouldn't have to go very far outside of your radius there for recruiting some of these guys. just someone that's going to be relentless on the recruiting trail, whether it be the head coach or whether having the guys in there on your staff that's going to understand that, adding those big time players and knowing that, the X's and O's are great, but the Jimmies and Joes can really bring in, and really raise your level of program. So I think for me, just someone that's going to understand that, at Florida, you have so many things to sell. You have, the big state program in the state of Florida. You've got the SEC to sell, just a lot of things to really sell at Florida. And I think that, being able to relate to those guys on the recruiting trail, and I guess maybe I'm a little bit more biased in my opinion, just because I cover recruiting. So I think for me, wanting someone in there that's really going to understand that recruiting is important. But I think overall, just understanding that your staff, I think one thing that was kind of a fault with Mullen was that he was really loyal to some of those guys. So I think understanding, the conference you're in, the level of play there, and understanding that, finding the right guys can be very important in a coaching staff and in your future of keeping things sustainable.
Yeah, I think the danger sometimes in some of these coaching hires, and from what I've seen covering, I go back to the Urban Meyer years here at Florida since I've been in this kind of position. The tendency is you kind of almost go a lot of times the opposite direction of the guy you just had, right? And a lot of the stuff you're describing are absolutely things that need to be fixed, need to be addressed as far as recruiting, bringing in better talent, making sure that, you're not blinded by staff loyalty to the point where, guys are not really getting it done. You got to have a good staff. So I think those are absolutely things that Florida is going to look for. I think the Gators do need to be careful not to overemphasize any one area. And I think Scott Strickland has a pretty good handle on that. I think the way that he runs Florida's program, he's done a really good job, I think, of pushing forward the infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I mean kind of bringing Florida up to speed in the modern college football arms race as far as facilities, as far as the amount of resources that Florida is allocating to the football program, the ability for coaches, when you hire them, you're kind of letting them do their thing. You trust them. That's what good leaders do. And I think, for Florida, you need to make sure you don't lose the developmental aspect as well. I do think Florida fans probably want an offensive coach.
I think Florida is one of those teams that, you think of, Steve Spurrier's, Urban Meyer's, even Dan Mullen, where you put up a lot of yards and a lot of points. So I think that's fair that fans would want a guy that's offensive, just because that's just when you think of Florida, you just think of points,
Right.
like you think of the team running up the score and airing it out.
Right. And I mean, as much as, we've kind of pounded the door about some of the things that Dan Mullen wasn't doing well, you really can't point to the offense that much. Now, obviously, there's been games, Missouri, an example of them not getting it done. But, when they were healthy this year, even this year, the offense was putting up pretty solid numbers against quality teams. So, it's important not to forget, the years before that. And I'm not saying that, the expectations should change just because the last three coaches have ultimately come in and failed. But I do think you have a dynamic where fans expect good offense, right? And so you need someone that's going to be able to produce that. It doesn't necessarily have to be an offensive guy, but it's got to be a guy, in my opinion, that, when you go to start your search is your Scott Strickland, which I'm sure he's done a couple weeks ago. You've got to have at least a semblance of a track record of being able to hire the type of offensive coaches that can get it done. If you're a defensive guy, I want to see, okay, what happened when you lost your best coordinator? What happened when you lost your best quarterback? And the guys that I think are going to be the best candidates for Florida are going to be ones that have shown that they can win in different ways, sort of similar to how Dan Mullen was able to adapt the offense from, what they had with Felipe Franks to a much more pass-heavy attack with Kyle Trask. That's what I'd be looking for. I think those are kind of the things that, Scott Strickland's going to be looking for. And ultimately, I think, the reason that Florida wanted to be so patient with Dan Mullen, Blake, and we reported, really up until, honestly, Sunday afternoon when we got, started to get texts about the team being called in for a meeting, they wanted to give him patience. It obviously got to a point where it was untenable. But I think one of the reasons they wanted to give him patience is Florida has a lot working for it right now from the back end standpoint. And what I mean by that is all of the infrastructure changes that Scott Strickland has pushed for, is pushing for. Blake, the facilities that are incredibly important to recruiting. To me, this sets up as just an absolutely perfect time for Florida to not only pitch this job to a really good candidate, but for that candidate to come walk in and be able to immediately start to build some momentum for Florida, especially on the recruiting trail.
Yeah, and that's what they need. You just have so many things you can sell to recruits. Having someone that understands how important it is. I think understanding that, the 4 and 5-star players, you got to work for them. You got to press for them. You've got to live, eat, sleep recruiting. And, and that's something that I'm looking forward to, hopefully with this next coaching staff, just because I'd be understating it if I said that it wasn't very fun covering recruiting over the last couple of years for me.
No doubt, man. And I'm not nearly as in the weeds as you are with recruiting. I think anybody that's followed you over the years knows that is, your bread and butter. And I kind of follow it from the helicopter view. But I do think there's a significant amount of evidence over the last 10, 15 years that the teams that are doing the best are stacking a lot of talent. And it doesn't mean you can't overcome a talent deficit within an individual game. It doesn't mean you can't, have a season where you have something spectacular happen, even though you're not maybe the most talented team. But by and large, there's a correlation there that plays out. And I think Florida is a place where you shouldn't have to settle on recruiting, right? And when you get to that level of, the top SEC jobs, you got to be able to do it all. You got to be a 5-tool prospect, and at least the effort in all of those phases has to be there. So, Blake, I'm with you. Let's take a quick break. I think when we come back on the other side, let's talk a lot about some of the candidates we think may fit for this job. We'll talk a little bit about some of the VIP info we've posted on Swamp 24/7 in the last 24 hours, really the last 12 hours. And we'll discuss some of that right after this commercial break. Welcome back to the Swamp 24/7 podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Goldkamp, here with Blake Alderman. Blake, right before we went to commercial, we were talking about some of the things that we think Florida will be looking for in this hire as they set out to replace Dan Mullen. I think one of the things that was pretty interesting, listening to Scott Strickland at his Sunday press conference after he announced Dan Mullen, would be fired and they would be moving a different direction. He made it very clear to point out that Florida is very aligned from an administration standpoint, from the university president down to the board of directors, board of trustees, the UAA itself with Strickland and the boosters. And I thought that was an interesting comment, to say the least. Obviously, in my opinion, some of that is, kind of peacocking a little bit for prospective potential targets, and we'll talk more about those in a minute. But I think that's something to keep in mind. First and foremost, I guess let's start talking about candidates. Lane Kiffin is a guy that I know a lot of Florida fans have kind of been hyped about. I think mostly the younger generation. I think there's a little bit of a generational divide on where Florida fans stand on Kiffin. Blake, I guess I'm not even going to really ask for your thoughts on Lane Kiffin, because I can tell you from my end, after talking to several really pretty good sources, I don't think Florida is in the market for Lane Kiffin at all. I think because of some behind the scenes things that have already gone down at Florida, I think he's a candidate you just can't touch. And there's some reasons behind that if Scott Strickland and his staff have already done some vetting, I think they've probably run into a thing or two at Ole Miss that has raised enough of a red flag that Lane Kiffin is not a candidate for Florida at this time. So I'll get that out of the way real quick. Blake, let's talk about some of the other guys. I don't know if there's anyone that sticks out in particular to you. I know we talked about 4 or 5 names going in. Anybody you want to start with?
I think we should start with Billy Napier. I think that's the one where a lot of smoke is out there on his name. And, for me, that's an offensive guy. The more you look into him, you see he's very organized on a lot of things he does from, top to bottom. And I think that was something that the last staff with Mullen, I thought the organization, especially in the recruiting offices, was something they really lacked, And so I think having someone come in very organized, very detailed, I think that's something that makes him an appealing person to me, on top of him being an offensive-minded guy. And I think, I do think in general, Florida fans want an offensive guy. I don't think they're opposed to a defensive guy. I think once you start to fill out the staff, you can kind of make sense of that, what you will. But again, I think that's just a guy, just for my opinion, that just checks a lot of boxes off from what Florida fans are looking for and what I think he brings as a head coach.
Yeah, I was going to say the narrative out there, the idea that he's a very, very good organizer. I think the fact that he's worked, for so many different top-notch coaches over the years. He's worked for Nick Saban. He's worked for Dabo Swinney. I think he's a guy that, obviously has had a good up-close look at high-level success in college football. Now, I think the downside to Napier would probably be that he hasn't been a head coach for very long. I do think,
or at a big time program,
or at a big time program,
looking, that's right, P5 school where he's at now.
And I think there's other candidates out there that may have a similar profile, maybe a Mario Cristobal, where they already have a little bit more of that big time head coaching experience. But as far as Napier goes, I got to be a little careful with what I say here because it is a fluid situation. But Blake, that we've done a lot of reporting on Swamp 24/7 already, and I'm going to just shamelessly take this opportunity to plug our 60% off promotion. We have a 60% off promotion for annual subscribers to Swamp 24/7, where you can read all of our updates on Coaching Scoop. Blake will have plenty of Recruiting Scoop. That's only going to be available till midnight tonight, guys. So if you want to take advantage of that, please do. But on to kind of a little bit of what we've reported for VIP subscribers. Blake, my sense is very much that, well, not my sense. I know that there is quite a bit of mutual interest between Billy Napier and Florida about the job. I've done a lot of back-end digging with some Louisiana contacts, both on the ULL side and at LSU. And Billy Napier is going to leave for a bigger job this offseason. I feel very, very confident saying that. The sense around the University of Lafayette from some sources that I'm, have tapped and are plugged into. Full disclosure, my sister just graduated there from graduate school. I have numerous family members that went to ULL. So I have a couple connections in the area. The sense when the LSU job came open, Blake, was that LSU wasn't really all that interested in Billy Napier, and there wasn't a whole lot of, I guess, interest is the best way to say it. And not only that, but from the ULL side, they initially, I think, were concerned about that LSU job coming open, and within a week or two, they felt much better about it from people pretty high up over there at ULL. So I think there's a lot of interest in Billy Napier, and I'm going to try not to monopolize too much time here, but I think there's a lot of interest in Billy Napier from Florida's end. I do not know if he's the number one target, and this will be something we're continuing to monitor at Swamp 24/7. But I do think he checks off a lot of those boxes, and so I think he's the guy right now that you got to really keep an eye on. Let's go ahead and talk some of the other candidates first, and then I think what we can do is shift maybe towards more of the process and how the timeline may play out. I mentioned Mario Cristobal, Blake. I'm curious to get your thoughts on him because I know he's a guy that has over the years recruited extensively in the state of Florida, and I'm sure you've heard things about what he might bring to the table.
For me personally, if I had the, athletic director hat on and I was calling the shots of all the, names that have been floated, linked, hot boards, whatever you want to call it for, linked to the Florida job, Mario Cristobal is my personal favorite. And I say that because you look at the staff that he formed at Oregon. I think he's a really tremendous person in the fact that he builds, a really good staff. He's had some up and down games, lost some games that they should have won. I think that's just part of football. That's part of coaching. Yep. But for me, one of the interesting things for me is that he's an offensive line type of guy. And if you get a guy that's going to be a great play caller, you're able to focus on, yes, being a head coach. And there's a lot of details that go into that. But I think something that Florida really needs is just an infusion on that offensive line. I mean, how many years have we sat there and said, man, Florida can win this game if the offensive line shows up. Man, Florida needs to recruit better on the offensive line. Man, the offensive line this, offensive line that. So I think that just the fact that him being kind of the guru on the offensive line, I think that's something that's really intriguing to me. I think, again, if he's able to form the type of staff that he formed at Oregon, I think that he could do a lot. It's interesting to me to see what he could do at a school like Florida, where it's a really appealing school in the SEC, where I think it would be an attractive spot for a lot of coaches to want to come in and join up with him. The ties to South Florida. South Florida is, the bread and butter for, any school in the country to recruit at. So I think the ties are interesting there. And even just guys around, the state of Florida, you just see guys from Oregon that are interested, guys from Florida that are interested in Oregon. Right. You see so many guys that visit out there. If you're getting guys to go out there and visit, and yes, all those things are cool, the jerseys and Nike and all those types of things, but you're still getting guys from Florida to go out and visit Oregon. You get a guy there that's right there in Florida. I'd be really interested to see what he could do as a recruiter because he's got the name of being a really good recruiter. He's got ties to Alabama, the offensive line, just pedigree he has there. And I think, again, he would build a really good staff. So I think for me personally, if I had to throw on, my Homer, AD type of hat, that's the guy that I think is most intriguing to me. And I think the one that I would lean towards, would be, not my favorite to land the job. That's not any info, but just my guy that I would think would be my favorite of the groups of guys that have been linked to Florida, just my personal favorite. Yeah.
I think after digging in a little bit, I think Napier and Cristobal are kind of 1A, 1B for me. And I'm not sure which order. I kind of lean toward Napier being A. I think there's a couple things with Cristobal to consider. I mean, number one, Florida's already, paid a $10 million buyout for Dan, or $12 million buyout. Sorry.
You're going to have to pay for Cristobal.
You're going to have to pay for him. I think it's around a $9 million buyout. So you're already talking $21 million. And I don't know. I don't know the booster side as well enough for the big money type boosters that are really making driving those kind of financial decisions, whether or not that's a factor. But I do think that's something to consider. And then the other thing is the Miami job. It's not officially open yet, but I have heard from a lot of well-connected people in this industry that there's something about the Miami job that has always appealed to Mario Cristobal in a way beyond just ties to the area. He's very, very. He seems very personally invested in Miami.
He's from there too. Was born there too. So I think there's always some kind of interest in that too.
Right.
Regardless of all the other things that Miami can bring for a guy like that.
I'll share one.
There's always that.
Yeah, I'll share one story I heard, and I don't. This is a secondhand source, but when Cristobal was at Alabama, apparently he would be livid sometimes when Alabama would go in and take a recruit from South Florida that Miami was also recruiting. Like he thought that shouldn't happen. Like, and he was literally frustrated by that. The story that was relayed to me by somebody I trust, not firsthand info, but the way it was explained to me is he seems like a kind of guy that would have special allure.
Born in Dade, stayed in Dade type of thing with recruits.
And the other thing is, you can make the argument that would he want to come back to Florida? He's in Gainesville, that's close enough to South Florida. It's not really an easy flight for you've been in Gainesville. You can't just really hop on a flight, go down to Miami. So it's maybe not as close as it seems. But I think anyway, that's something to consider. I don't know. Who do you want to talk next?
Do we need to talk Bob Stoops? I mean, do we need to throw that one out there? That's like the unicorn of every Florida.
I know it's out there, and I know that I laugh at that. I don't think it's completely outside the realm of possibility.
But I'd be very surprised.
I go back to what Strickland said about wanting a guy that can sustain high-level success over a long period of time. And Bob Stoops is getting up there in age, man, and if there's anything that we've learned over the last couple of years, it's that the game evolves pretty rapidly. And what you need to get used to in college football, just the early signing period has created a huge wrinkle in terms of the timeline process for hiring coaches, right? So it's something that's always evolving, and I just don't think that's the direction that Florida needs to go. I understand there's probably a lot of, old school booster types that love Bob Stoops and, kind of credit him in a lot of ways for helping win that 96 title, but I don't see that, Blake. I think the other interesting name is actually Mark Stoops.
See, that's where I'm at too. I think if a Stoops was going to be realistic, I think it would be Mark. And I know you said that there's some ties, I believe, somewhere along the line.
Yeah, Scott Strickland worked extensively in Kentucky's sports information department back in the day, and he's very close with Mitch Barnhart over at Kentucky. And so I think if you were, looking for a guy who probably isn't necessarily high up on the public radar right now, that Strickland would be able to easily back channel with and have a pulse on exactly how well Stoops has done at Kentucky, I think he's a guy you watch for. Now, Blake, from my standpoint, I actually thought Mark Stoops has done a really, really good job at Kentucky, and I've always been high on him. But I was surprised. I went back and looked, when I was kind of making a point about how college football has changed so much in explaining, things have shifted for Dan Mullen, and this was a couple weeks back I looked at it. Dan Mullen's record at Mississippi State, playing in a much more difficult division, is a lot better than Mark Stoops' currently is. And that, to me, is a little bit of a red flag because Kentucky's made some investments in facilities. They've got the best facilities that they've had for football ever, and they've put a lot of work into the infrastructure. So I'd be concerned that he's not winning at a higher level at Kentucky. He's done some very impressive things there. So I'm not trying to downplay any of that. But I personally would worry about that translating.
Yeah, I would too. He could build a program up from the ground up. I just feel like that's very similar to, where you mentioned before, where a lot of coaches want to do something different than the one behind him. I just don't know that there'd be a lot of differences between what Florida had and what they would get in him.
Yeah. So, Blake,
Matt Campbell seems like the other guy. Matt Campbell seems like the other guy. I think he's the hot name that's been on every coaching search the last couple of years. Iowa State head coach, that's a program that, who would have thought that, they're a top 10, 15 team heading into the season.
Yeah, exactly.
So he's definitely a guy that, has built up a program, but it seems like there's been a little bit more sustainability. I don't think this year is really what they probably would have wanted for a lot of things, but I think it's commendable what he's been able to do there.
Yeah. I mean, from afar, I don't know as much about Campbell, and I don't know. I don't want to say that makes me hesitant on discussing him or anything, but I just frankly I haven't had as many connections reach out or offer info on him that I would trust. So I don't know. I'm completely looking at that from afar. I think what he's done at Iowa State is hard to deny, but I don't know that he has the kind of ties maybe to the Southeast that you would kind of want in a coach.
Seems like a Midwest type of guy, though.
Right. Like I don't know that he's the guy you want if you're looking for a big sudden uptick in recruiting. And not that that's the only focus. I mean, I think he's done a really good job organizing that program over at Iowa State.
There's some unknowns though.
Yeah, to me, I'm not really in the camp that he's high up on the list right now. So
I'm not either, but he's worth mentioning because he's
I mean,
he's on whatever school you want to mention.
Yeah.
They've got a hot board. He's on it,
and it sounds like he may be in play for the LSU job too, which I think that could potentially have trickle down impacts with Florida as far as LSU. I mean, I do think if LSU were to reciprocate interest with Billy Napier, that could change the dynamic. Right now, that's not happening. I feel pretty strongly about that from the sources we've spoken to. But yeah, so that I think the LSU domino. I don't know exactly when things will happen on different jobs or how related they are. So, Blake, maybe let's talk about timeline. Like, what's your just general expectation of how fast this kind of needs to happen for Florida to maybe get ahead of things before early signing period, or does that not need to be like? Can you not worry about that almost because you got to get the right guy?
I think if you have the right guy, I could see maybe some movements on a timeline. But for me, I just think the early signing period has just gotten to be so important. And you've got that first weekend of December, the 4th through the 6th. That's usually the first official visit weekend that you have, So I would think, from my knowledge of, the early signing period and, where Florida's at ranked in the 40s right now in their class. And you've got guys that, have already left, and a guy like Isaiah Bond, Jamarian Burt, who left the class too, after the announcement of Mullen. I think you're going to need to start giving some guys some clarity, that's in your class more. You don't want to continue to lose some of the guys in your class, the Nick Evers, the Jaden Gibsons, and plenty of other guys in there too. So you're going to have guys that are going to be able to take another official visit if they choose to, since Florida's had a head coaching change. So I think from just a recruiting standpoint, I think ideally having something at least kind of figured out before that first weekend of December, have guys come in there and take the visits and get to know the guys and kind of go from there as you try to fill the class in before the early signing period. And I think, again, the early signing period being where it's at and where a lot of the coaching carousel starts, I just think it's very important to have some kind of idea by, when December starts to crank up.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other thing to consider is Florida wanted to be patient with Dan Mullen, but I think it would be naive to assume that like this search is on day 2 right now or whatever it is, day 1, day 2, because quite frankly, you don't make that kind of decision unless you've considered some alternatives, some plan Bs like that. If you're in that chair as AD at Florida, you've done some homework already. I would imagine most of that started probably after the Georgia game, where you're starting to think, okay.
If not, then you think the South Carolina game.
Yeah, like
that was just a bad slap in the face type of loss.
Yeah, where you're thinking, okay, if this goes worst case scenario, what am I going to do if I'm Scott Strickland? And I think they've probably already back channeled quite a bit. Strickland is very, very connected to the agent world. He's very connected to all those back end channels that he needs to kind of get a pulse on things, so to speak. And that's why I do think the timeline will happen relatively quickly. I think you're probably going to not see anything official until some games are played. And there's coaches still playing games. Billy Napier will be playing a conference championship game that first week of December. So I don't, if he's the guy, I don't know if maybe it comes out that he's expected to take the Florida job and then they announce officially after that. That's pure speculation on my part. Don't have any inside info on that. If we get it, It'll be on Swamp 24/7. But I do think right now, based on our reporting, I think Florida is very much engaged with Billy Napier. And I think once that usually starts to happen, what you see is leverage cards being played. If Billy Napier is interested in Florida and knows he has a really good offer from Florida, there's literally nothing that should stop him from reaching out to LSU and saying, hey, if you guys want me, man, now's the time, to make an offer and kind of push your leverage card that way. And it's the thing that, agents are extremely good at. I'm not saying that he's doing that and would pick Florida over or would pick LSU over Florida. I don't know that. We'll get more info. But I think that's a significant factor potentially. And I think what we're probably going to see here is over the next couple days, don't be surprised if there's not a whole lot of news. Typically, when you go through these coaching searches, and we saw this as kind of the Chip Kelly thing heated up, and then it really kind of hit a lull for a couple days. And it wasn't until we found out kind of after the fact, after Chip Kelly kind of eventually told them later in the week, hey, not really interested, that things happened very quickly with Florida's next target, right? So I think I feel pretty good about Billy Napier being a guy that Florida has heavy interest in. Is he number one? Not sure right now, but I think you're going to see probably a little bit of a lull here as, again, games are still waiting to be played as leverage cards get played between different universities, between different agents and the coaches. Blake, I don't know if there's anything else that we need to hit on. That was kind of my take on just laying out
nothing on a coaching search that I can think of, but from a recruiting update, 4-star defensive lineman Chris McClellan will be making his decision at 3:30 Eastern time today. Alabama, Florida, Oklahoma, LSU, Ohio State are some of the finalists off the top of my head. 24/7 Sports Cristobal still points at Florida despite not having a head coach, which is kind of a first for me, seeing a high profile, on the cusp of a top 100 guy. The intel all still kind of points to Florida. I've thought for a while, Florida, Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. It seems like Oklahoma is looking at other guys. I'm really kind of happy with where they're at in the interior part of the defensive line. Florida obviously needs help on the defensive line. So at this point, I'll have any updates that I hear leading up to that announcement on the site on Swamp 24/7. But for now, my pick's on Florida, and I don't plan to change it.
Nice. Yeah, see, I had no idea. I've been so head in my phone and hitting sources and everything.
When there's an update on the site for coaching nuggets at 1 a.m., it's a grind.
Yeah, man. Didn't even realize he was committing today. So there you go, man. We got a lot to plug on Swamp 24/7. I guess before I sign off, guys, I'm going to remind you real quick, we do have a 60% off an annual membership discount for our VIP subscribers on Swamp 24/7. Highly encourage you to check it out. There is never a better time to sign up than when we have a coaching search going on. We're kind of giving you the latest twists and turns on that based on things we can talk about and confirm. And then obviously Blake does just an absolutely tremendous job with recruiting. So check it out, Swamp 24/7, 60% discount until midnight tonight. Hope you guys all take advantage of that. Again, I didn't share all of the Billy Napier info that I shared with subscribers because, that is a perk that we provide for them. But if you subscribe and sign up, you can also get that. Guys, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Swamp 24/7 podcast. We thank you for tuning in.